In a world where people think and say what they see and hear, welcome to the Daily Liable Mission. You look around you, the elections, our divisions in society, morality, and wealth. The fiscal bankruptcy of our government is too plain to see. At the end of it all, the one thing we Americans all agree upon is that our system of government has failed, and that to go forward, we must change, because just as 32 empires have come and gone before, today, America's empire is upon its own fourth turning. I'd like to start out by laying out the problem, then sharing with you the anatomy and art of revolution to help draw a picture of the historic process we have entered. I'll then describe the only way out, liberty, its anatomy, the science behind it, and the changes it creates in both foreign and domestic policy. Can you imagine a world without war? Because liberty alone will unleash the full force of the human spirit as never before. There are only two forms of government in our world. One is when the government rules over the people. The other, when the people rule over that government. There is nothing else. When the government rules includes communism, fascism, socialism, and democracy. All are categorized as the status state. In diametric opposition is when the people rule over their government. This is called a state of liberty. Each defines the other by which it is not, a pure mathematical equation of logic and a theoretic basis upon which to establish a daily operating model of government. But you know what the real problem is? We live in a cyclical world, ruled by linear minds. Picture a business cycle, up, down, expansion, contraction of business. Growth whose excess creates bankruptcies that tighten the ship, reset capital formation, and set the stage for the next round of expansion. Now take that cycle and beat it into submission with economic alchemy by forming a club where cash isn't king. Just cheap quantitative easing credit with a commitment to inflate the economy in an upward trajectory where inflation pays the bill and time renders failure and poor judgment a success. It's the mantra and holy grail of soulless economists. Buy the freaking dip. If the Bureau of Lies and Statistics still used the economic models of the Reagan administration, it would show the United States in a depression for the past 15 years, a metric altered by Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich to create the illusion of balancing the budget. It just goes to show the destruction of America has been a bipartisan affair. Now America is bankrupt, $20 trillion in the hole, with a debt-to-GDP ratio over 100%, at which point it becomes mathematically difficult to service those debt, much less pay it down. So our linear rulers, who have straightened out the cycle of our lives for their benefit, are at the end of our rope, which they're burning from both ends on cheap credit and questionable cash flow, both of which, unless you already have it, you're not going to get it. So it's easy to say how this schism between the wealth of haves and has-nots has become a reality, and a fuse. That is why history calls a governmental bankruptcy a revolution. It's when the people have had enough. An interesting side note on bankruptcies is they happen twice. First slowly, then suddenly when we find ourselves out on the street. Revolutions are the same way. Let's talk about the anatomy and art of revolution, because revolution is not the science that liberty is comprised of. Crane Britton's 1938 classic, Anatomy of a Revolution, reviews the English, American, French, and Russian revolutions, breaking down each revolution into 4 different stages. The first Britton calls the turning of the intellectuals, when sufficient numbers of society's notables turn against the government, leading the masses to overthrow the old government, a historic event known as a tipping point. The second stage begins with the installation of the replacement government Britton calls the modern government, which, when hampered by the systemic failure of the system it has inherited and under attack from all other factions, both right and left, who covet power, it too is finally overthrown. This begins the third stage and marks a major escalation in violence, which can easily evolve into a civil war as the fighting spreads across the nation. The entire process ends in the fourth stage, called a thermidor, or cooling off period that lasts a generation, as the faction that lost the least consolidates their control. because there are no winners in a revolution, and the precarious winner is compelled to turn all power over to a strongman, fascist state, another status state in order to survive, because in the end, the entire process is a senseless meat grinder. Revolution is not an exacting process, and conditions and events create different realities depending upon those conditions. As an example, the United States did not experience the fratricide of England, France, or Russia because in the U.S. there was little division in the population because the enemy was 3,000 miles away. Further, there was no real threat of outside interference as seen in the French and Russian revolutions. I would present to you that the first stage of our current American Revolution occurred during the campaigns of Bernie and Trump, that the tipping point was November 8th, and the second stage began on January 20th. As I mentioned, forecasting a revolution is an art, and so I would add two contemporary notes of great concern. Whereas there was little division among Americans in 1776, a huge schism divides America today. Second, America's revolt, November 8th, was not a turning of the intellectuals, but just the opposite. A revolution generated from the grassroots level, pitting the deplorables against the systemic failure of a highly organized governing system of propaganda. And whether you're a Trumpite or a Bernieist, it doesn't matter, because you're already locked into one of the only two systems of government, leaving only one alternative available. That is the state of liberty, when the people rule over their government. Now, considering 32 state empires have been destroyed over recorded millennial, it all begins to play into Einstein's definition of insanity, doesn't it? Repeating the same mistake over and over, expecting a different result? Or is it time to set aside the control of the linear mind and embrace the cyclical, to free mankind from the linear restrictions of man, to free each person, every individual, to be all they can be, unrestricted from the collateral damage of cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men with access to power? So our objective is to cut the access to power by the few, by granting it to all. Can such a refuge, a political Eden, exist? And if so, what does it look like? How does it work? And how do we get back to the garden? First, let's take a look where we have been. A state of liberty originally existed in America in 1789. It was called the Great Experiment, a democratic republic, a balance between the swaying mob rule of a democracy restrained by the altruistic authority of Plato's guardian in the republic. Liberty was first established in our Declaration of Independence, which was crafted around the concept of a government ruled by the consent of the governed. Its first ground fell short in the Articles of Confederation due to the lack of sufficient centralization to bind the states together. These shortcomings were remedied in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the result of which is our U.S. Constitution, a federalization of state powers into a whole, but structured as a daily governing model of systemic decentralization designed to push the decision-making powers of government closer to the people. Its twofold purpose: to, one, allow the quantitative mind of all the people to guide their government, and two, to simultaneously deny the reins of power to those cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men and women who would otherwise hold sway over all. But today we live in a nation where the people's power has been tranched and usurped to the executive branch, its agencies, the Federal Reserve Bank, and even the court. It is this anticipation that caused Abraham Lincoln to warn, "Don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it is the only safeguard of our liberties." And do not to Democrats alone do I make this appeal, but to all who love these great and true principles. Now, the problem with liberty today is if you ask 100 people to define it, you will get 100 different answers. Yet there is only one answer. Liberty is a government ruled over by its people through a constitutional social contract whose decentralizing process guarantees the consent of the governed, and through it guarantees to each individual their personal freedom to live a life uncoerced by those who would otherwise exert their control. And what went wrong, then, with the spirit of 76 and its governance within a state of liberty known as the Great Experiment? What went wrong? There were a few problems. The first was America's misunderstanding of the magnitude of the dialectic opposition against liberty by the status state. This created the second problem, the total miscalculation of the strategy of isolationism, which only served to play into the dialectic of the enemy. Free of attack by the superior force of liberty, it was free to attack liberty instead, and so it did, compromising the French Revolution while tying America into knots through the manipulation of its money supply via the first U.S. bank. Finally, no one really understood the Great Experiment because no one had any experience operating such a novelty. It was all new. Based upon the separation of powers, it was contingent upon the consent of the governed, with all the powers to create our laws and money set firmly into the hands of the People's Congress as well established in Article 1 of our Constitution. But what no one understood was the unintended consequence of allowing any powers of Congress to be granted to any agency, and this remains the constant battle ever since because it makes null and void any possible consent of the governed. This tyrant's seed was sown early on by the self-serving Federalists in our government like Alexander Hamilton, America's first neocon, but primarily by Chief Justice John Marshall's rulings, which unconstitutionally amended those provisions used to transfer power away from the People's Congress and into the hands of cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men. Marshall's two landmark rulings are Marbury v. Madison, 1803, and McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, both of which opened a foothold for the professional sociopath to seize the power to deny Americans' right to rule and our birthright to the prosperity and freedom inherent to a state of liberty. Marbury has since been used to expand the court's power to not only overrule Congress, but to write its laws, powers never imagined by the Constitution for the court. In McCulloch v. Maryland, Justice Marshall unambiguously kicked open the wholesale theft of the people's powers of Congress by conveniently ignoring the word proper in the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 9 of our Constitution. In doing so, Marshall amended our Constitution extra-constitutionally to now read the necessary, but not necessarily proper clause, flinging open the door for the theft of our nation's birthright. So what does the word proper mean in a state of liberty? Both the Federalist Papers and Madison's notes on the convention are broad and non-committal, save in the Federalist, which admits the word proper should be prejudiced in favor of the states over that of the federal government. Still devoid of meaning, I turned to President Washington to see if he had anything to say upon the subject, and he doesn't let us down. In his farewell address to the nation, Washington recalls the one major mistake he made during his presidency, and that was to allow the charter of a power of Congress to an agency outside of Congress. And in this case, it was America's first experiment with a private central bank, the first U.S. bank. In a warning reminiscent of President Eisenhower's admonition against the military-industrial complex, Washington warned that despite the best intentions, such assignment of power always ends up in the hands of cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men, and that this is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So much for the rule of law. The eventual result has been the unconstitutional overthrow of the United States and her stakeholders, we, the people, from a state of liberty to the status state of being ruled by our government. Today, 90% of our laws are either made by a public, independent, or private agency and never sees the light of day in Congress. Instead, these laws are reviewed by the White House office of faceless bureaucrats holding hearings with no notes, no recordings, no transcripts, and no Freedom of Information Act. It's called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs and has created the imperial presidency, becoming a clearinghouse for lobbyist contributions to the president's party in order to buy the best laws money can buy. Unless, of course, it's an independent agency like the FDA, the SEC, or the private corporation, the Federal Reserve Bank. That's how Monsanto, Big Pharma, big banks on Wall Street get away with murder. They buy direct. Our only hope for America, for all of mankind, is to change a corrosive, antiquated system steeped in the illusions of security and to reestablish a state of liberty so that we may govern ourselves and enjoy the freedom and the share the wealth of its bounty unbound by those linear minds who would otherwise drive us in our future into their pockets. I know. You're wondering about the garden. First, I'd like to explain how we get back to the garden, then how it works and what it changes, so you can finish the portrait of liberty in your mind. I've selected 4 bills before Congress today and 1 amendment, together comprising 3 acts of Congress that will restore all the powers of the people back to a Congress over which we will rule. I call it liberty legislation, and liberty legislation must become the litmus test for anyone asking for our vote. If they support these bills, we support them. If they deny our birthright, we will deny them. We don't need candidates. The candidates need us. First up is everyone's dream, an amendment for term limits. If there is one thing all Americans agree upon, it is term limits for all members of Congress. And if we are to be a nation of citizens, professional politicians are an anathema and requires no further explanation. This is followed up with 4 bills before Congress today. The first is best known as House Bill 24, an audit of the Federal Reserve Bank's role in the housing bailout in 2010. It's a snapshot of unbridled corruption, repulsive to every American, and will end the private Federal Reserve, their weapons of financial destruction, fiat money, and terminate the concentrated wealth of our ruling 0.01%. The next 3 bills are known as Write the Laws Act. The first, Senate Bill 1663, requires that all laws must be passed by the Congress and has been augmented by the REINS Act, which recently passed the House on January 8th. Senate Bill 1664 requires that only 1 item can be attached to a bill so that there are no more omnibus bills laden with pork. The last bill, SB 1665, requires that each bill before final vote be read on the floor of each house before it is voted upon. These bills will end the practice of passing 1,250-page health care laws no one reads and loaded down with lobbyist favors, with the next 20,000 pages to be written by lobbyists under the auspices of an agency. It means the end of 70,000-page tax laws that consume millions of unproductive hours that would otherwise generate real wealth and jobs in America. Most important, these 3 bills mean that the issues important to everyday Americans like you and me will be paraded out in the open for all to see. Our representatives will have to vote open and notorious for our scrutiny, and the restoration of the consent of the governed will be at hand. First, Congress won't have the time to do both their jobs and encroach upon the powers of the states, and so restores the 10th Amendment. This is a final example of the cause and effect that a state of liberty installs, or as Washington said, liberty, once taken root, as a plant of rapid growth, because it will move through America like a wildfire. We'll see a number of federal agencies disappear, their powers to be taken up by our 50 respective states whose mirror agencies are already established and staffed. And what is more efficient to America? 50 states working on the same problem, or one federal government, centralized and easily accessed by the plague of locusts? Foremost will be the orderly removal and replacement of the Federal Reserve Bank. The Fed will be replaced by a publicly held by Congress American Reserve Bank, organized upon the precepts of New England Suffolk Bank from 1816 to 1860, in conjunction with a classical gold standard. Technocrats and economists will tell you that it can't be done, but it's all been done before, and it was wildly successful. Cash has freedom, and the status state hates cash, because in a state of liberty, the people not only rule over their government, but also over their money. It is the death knell of superwealth and eradicates the gulf between have and has not, restores the dying middle class, and revitalizes the American dream, so that you no longer have to be asleep to believe it. The big payoff, however, is in foreign policy. I call it the peace of freedom, and it makes war obsolete at incredible savings. Have you ever wondered how America can never make good on Social Security and provide health care, education, and a meaningful life for all? It cannot be done in a world at war. and a state of liberty is the only way to end it. For a time, we'll have to maintain a strong defense, but offensive operations will come to an end as the entire strategy of war requires us to attack a nation's tyrant not through bombs, but through the tyrant's own people he oppresses. Attack any nation, and they will flock to their tyrant's standard. But show them the change in America, and they will want it for themselves. Each day their tyrant will go weaker, trying to compete against the United States of America, steeped in the growing bounty, wealth, and freedom of liberty, until he is powerless to strike out at neither his people nor the United States of America. Our world is at a crossroad. We must either change the ways of centuries and advance to meet our full potential, or we will be destroyed because we lacked the courage to put the past behind. Thank you for your time and consideration. You can read the text of this address at the websites at the end of this broadcast. I'm your host, William W. Faywell. Surf's up, America.